Welcome to this session in our seminar series on creative economies in Africa. The title of today's talk, you can see there on the screen, Innovation, Indigenous Knowledge and Africa's Creative Economies. And this is going to be presented by our guest speaker, Professor Enyinna Nwauche, who you can see on the screen and who I will introduce shortly. Just to tell you a little bit about the seminar series, this is part of Recreate, the Recreate initiative, which is a collaboration between King's College in London, Aarhus University and Humboldt University in Berlin, which supports new research methods and networks around creative economies in Africa, with the focus especially of building capacity of young or early career researchers. It's also an activity of the Cluster of Research Excellence called Creative Economies, Cultures, Innovation and Sustainability, which is supported by the African Research University Alliance and the Guild, which is the European counterpart. The Cluster of Research Excellence spans across continents. It's led by myself at Rhodes University in South Africa, by Professors Roberta Kamunian and Eka Ikpe from King's College in London, and Professor Dura Oni from the University of Lagos. So having told you a bit about the association supporting the seminar series, I would now like to introduce our distinguished speaker. That is Professor Enyinna Nwauche. He is a law professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, but he has wide experience. So he's previously taught also at Rhodes University in South Africa, the University of Botswana, and Rivers State University in Nigeria. He's a rated National Research Foundation scholar and held visiting positions in the US, in Canada, where he's currently joining us from today, Germany, the UK, and Austria. So really a person of great international knowledge and experience. He also has a distinguished legal background. He was the chair of the coordinating committee of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers, a member of the executive committee of the International Association for Constitutional Law, and a former director general of the Nigerian Copyright Commission. If you look up his research profile, you will see his very distinguished publication record of peer-reviewed articles and also books. And it's one of these books that we have invited him to come and talk about specifically today. The book is called The Protection of Indigenous Knowledge in Africa, and it's published by Springer this year in 2025. So to give you a bit of background about the book, across Africa, indigenous knowledge is not just only a repository of ancestral wisdom. It's also a living resource that feeds into lots of parts of the creative industries like music, design, literature, film, and technology. And I think it's this connection between the creative industries, indigenous knowledge, and innovation that we don't see all that often, and which I think is absolutely key here. So we're very privileged to have you with us, Prof. This book, you'll notice, is the second edition of a book. And so it expands beyond the traditional creative or cultural expressions to include also the scientific and technical indigenous knowledge types. And it invites us to think critically about how indigenous knowledge is governed, commodified, and contested in Africa's legal, political, and economic systems. And this is especially relevant at the moment because of all the debates around artificial intelligence and copyright and so on. And so if we think about indigenous knowledge systems in Africa, it's the intellectual and cultural capital of communities, who sometimes marginalized communities, that needs to be governed and protected. So without further ado, I would like to invite Prof Nwauche to address us.
Thank you very much, Jen, and thank you, Roberta and Eka, for the invitation. I'm delighted to speak on a subject that is, of course, I think that is very important, and in the conversations we had before we started, that not many lawyers get into in the continent and beyond. And one of the challenges that I've had is that indigenous knowledge, like all knowledge, will be extracted. All societies create value from knowledge, and if you do not extract value from what you have, in a sense, others will. And this has been a challenge of indigenous knowledge in Africa for centuries. In the late 50s and 60s, as we got into the second and third industrial revolutions of information and communication technology, the importance of intangibles became profound, and indigenous knowledge turned up in our sites and became a matter of contestation. And what has happened over the years has been the fact that we're battled in Africa to determine who extracts this knowledge, who uses it, and for what. And that has been the challenge we have. The real issue, in a sense, for us is the fact that, as I probably demonstrate, the creative and cultural industries in Africa is underpinned by indigenous knowledge in all facets. And this is a fact that makes it one that is important for us to think about and, in a sense, grapple with. So I'm trying to get these slides on, yes. So if I may just give an overview of the presentation, I'd like to make a link between indigenous knowledge and Africa's creative economies in addressing what I call Africa's innovation emergency. We are in an emergency in Africa. Of course, it's an emergency that is not widely acknowledged or even articulated or debated. There is a group, right section of Africans who like to think that we should celebrate Africa into the world. And I think that we should really be truthful about our capacities to be able to redress them. And I've used two ideas of regulatory incoherence and convergence as principal factors why Africa is not doing well. If indigenous knowledge, if the creative and cultural industries are not doing well in Africa, they're not producing goods and services, it's because there's a major problem with Africa's innovation system. And then, of course, I will try to paint the state of protection of indigenous knowledge in Africa as an example of that regulatory incoherence, and then articulate how what I call regulatory convergence can assist in developing indigenous knowledge-based goods and services as part of Africa's creative economies with practical examples. So this is a slight overview, which many who are in this seminar would know very well. I understand, and of course many here do, that there is no clear path to understanding the breadth of the cultural and creative industries in Africa. I've teased and taken this from UNESCO classification, and these areas, the cultural and natural heritage, the performance and celebration, the visual arts and crafts, the books and press, the audiovisual and interactive media, design and creative services, and intangible cultural are, I suspect, agreed areas of the cultural and creative industries. And even if there are contestations as to the breadth and what should be and should not be. I suspect that this is something that is more like orthodox. And for me, the fascination is that if you look at Africa's indigenous knowledge, you would see clearly how its fingerprint is in every part of the cultural and creative industries. It may not be at some production levels, but in terms of content, inspiration, ideas, expressions, a lot of what is in Africa is somewhat, in some sense, influencing, affecting the creative industries. So I have set out the three main divisions of African indigenous knowledge in popular discourse. You would run into traditional knowledge, which is scientific and technical, and traditional cultural expressions, which are in the arts and the crafts, and of course the genetic resources. And there are, of course, quite some strong beliefs that indigenous knowledge is better treated as wholesome, as interdependent, for us to get a better idea of how it functions and how it operates. In any sense, Africa's indigenous communities do not have these distinctions. So these distinctions have grown in the course of the international fight, struggle, debate about what to protect. So ordinarily, traditional knowledge is associated with patents and traditional cultural expressions with copyright, trademarks, designs, and all that. And genetic resources also is associated with patents. But Africa is a changing continent, and I thought it was important to think about clearly how what is Africa's indigenous knowledge is not known. There is no documentation, there is no database that is complete across the continent of 54 countries, 3,000 ethnic groups, over 2,100 languages. 50% of Africans live in urban areas. And why that is important is that in these areas, there's a lot of mixture over the years from the colonial periods of urban areas as a product of the colonial enterprise, which Africans were drawn from rural areas from different countries, turning up to mix together ideas, cultures, practices, rituals, values, and institutions. To give us a pause to the idea about whether we are speaking about knowledge that is pure, that is consigned to one group, or knowledge that is produced over a period. And of course, foreign influences, examples of which we know. Most of the textiles that are considered to be African are actually products of Europe. There's no textile, there's no history of any ethnic African group in the 18th, 19th century that were in mass production of textiles. The batik, the other materials for textiles, all products from Europe. I mean, so that's an issue. So when you talk about an African indigenous knowledge, the question is, how much influence do you recognize? And of course, technology, including writing. And lots of people, some people claim that indigenous knowledge is oral, and in a sense, that if it is written, then it's not indigenous knowledge. That sounds a little pejorative. It's as if Africans are incapable of writing, but that's an issue. And of course, within many African countries and places and groups, there's been mass immigration and migration, which, creates a movement of culture as spatial, and people thinking about different things and ideas. And of course, an African diaspora who are in continuous communication with people who are in Africa and influencing the way Africans think, both in Africa and in the global north. And then, of course, the very powerful influences of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam, and its impact on culture in Africa and vice versa, which has led into all kinds of knowledge that African communities have used as a means of sustenance. So this is the state of which there is a huge, very huge, I suspect, under resource area that impinges on the cultural and creative industries, and that is a context that one bears in mind in approaching how this knowledge is extracted, is valued, is used, is policed across many African countries. So again, our potentials: 54 African countries, fastest growing continent, youngest continent. 40% of Africans have internet access. I think it is more. 68% internet penetration. 50% of Africans have a mobile phone, and between 10 to 40% use social media. These are all, I suspect, conservative estimates of what is going on in Africa. So this is rich for the creative economies. And the question is, why are we doing badly across Africa? Why are we producing very little and participating at the dismal level in the global creative and cultural industries? And this is evidence of it. Many studies of the economic contributions of the industry, corporate industries, which is part of the creative industry, says that they contribute 3 to 7% to the GDP. And I use two examples of very recent estimates as a show of potential, but also as a report of how badly we are doing. I'm sorry if I'm so stuck, but that's the reality. The creative and cultural industries and economies in Africa are not doing well. Okay, so Africa is imagined in the audiovisual industry to be able to do 20 billion USD and 20 million jobs between 2021 and 2026 from a UNESCO report. And Spotify's 2024 earnings report for Africa talks about a global earnings report of 10 billion USD. And Africa is doing the two largest African music countries, if you allow me to say that. This Nigeria and South Africa, and they do USD 59 million, and Nigeria doing 38 and South Africa doing 21. And you look at the figure, and we're not doing too well in a sense. And then you look at the dominant CCIs in Africa, film, music, and fashion, and you go back to this and ask the question, what is happening to the other parts of the cultural and creative industries? Something definitely is going on that is not correct. And therefore, you have this, which is just a little illustration of what I call Africa's innovation emergency. This is the Global Innovation Index score 2021 to 2024, the different countries, different years, and I have a couple of countries I've picked out. And the bulk of African countries are at the end of that report. Far more important for me and far more worrisome are the African countries that are missing from the Global Innovation Index. And I think I have here 23, and one is alarmed as to how half of the continent, in a sense, have no reported innovation activity. I know, of course, there are caveats as to how the report is put together, the indices that the report uses, and the fact there is very little records and statistical information from the continent and from these countries. But they are telling, I don't know how half of a continent would apparently not have some innovation activity or reported innovation activity, and it is not an emergency. And then I end my illustration of the emergency with a report from the Stanford University Artificial Index report of 2025 as to the activities in the artificial intelligence world, as it were, and there's absolutely no African presence developing either a large language model, a small language model, and but in a sense using AI models produced in the rest of the world. I don't know how that is not also an innovation emergency. So what I consider the regulatory incoherence in Africa's indigenous knowledge protection, which is really my idea about the state of that protection, is this. First, you have a conceptual dissonance in innovation policies where they exist. And part of that dissonance is understanding whether indigenous knowledge can also be an economic and industrial asset. Are we in Africa ring fencing indigenous knowledge as a pristine thing that should not be touched? And of course, the first reaction is that's a cultural asset, and that's a question of what exactly does that mean? I mean, there's no exclusivity or binary opposition between culture and economics or culture and trade. Do we even, in different African countries, contemplate indigenous knowledge as a part of the cultural and creative industries? There is understanding very much so about the creative cultural industries. Whether indigenous knowledge is considered as part of it is difficult to imagine in a sense. But of course, Africa's music, film, and fashion industries at the least are all, at the minimum, drawing inspiration from the creative and cultural industries. And the last question I ask is, how many African states have undertaken a national indigenous knowledge and a creative and cultural industries audits that they do know? Even in Africa's first 11, if you allow me to use that word, there's very little understanding of what exactly this industry means in terms of what it entails. Of course, in all the different countries, in Nigeria, there's a lot of information about the audiovisual industry, just the film industry in a sense, and a couple of other countries. But the other assets that we've seen are not things which are very much in the ideas of policymakers. Of course, there is the improper protection and balance between indigenous knowledge protection and intellectual property protection. And I go back to the first point I made, which is extracting value. If indigenous knowledge is not well protected, intellectual property will extract value from it, and that's what is happening. In a sense, in an ironic sense, by also members of these indigenous communities who have used ideas from indigenous knowledge, in a sense, to grow a largely popular genres in Africa that have appealed to the world, or the visual industry, the music industry, the Afrobeat, the Makossa, the South African Amapiano, and all out. The traces of indigenous knowledge written all over them. They have caught the world in a sense. So, I mean, so that's quite a good thing. Largely, indigenous knowledge is licensed by many states who have, in reaction to the interest in the world has had on indigenous knowledge in Africa, legislated this knowledge to be state property and provides mechanisms through which that will be licensed to third parties for use. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work in many parts of Africa. And I give you one or two examples. The Nigerian Copyright Commission is supposed to license the use of folklore. I'm not aware that any license has been made. The National Folklore Board in Ghana licenses folklore in Ghana, and I'm not sure that up to 10 or more than 9 or 10 licenses have been created. There are, of course, different facets. There are copyright collecting societies across French-speaking West Africa who double, copyright offices who double also as collecting collective management agencies in these countries who have licensed folklore, but at a very poor rate, and no one is sure exactly what is going on. But a lot of the intellectual property in these countries have traces of indigenous knowledge, because as I said earlier, which is quite understandable, somebody will extract value and keep it if one system or one branch of society does not do that. And in some of the other countries, we turn to intellectual property to protect indigenous knowledge, and that presents its own problems of the diffusion of how that is to be done and who owns this IP, intellectual property, and where the state owns this intellectual property. We're dealing with dysfunctional African states and their national institutions who don't function well, and therefore not able to actively produce and actively protect indigenous knowledge. And in a few other countries where communities are recognized as the owners, there is also a disconnect between the recognition of the ownership and the management. In simple terms, how are these communities allowed to manage their indigenous knowledge? Who do they license? How do they license? Do they license these properties without state oversight or with state oversight? Because these communities are imagined as incapable of granting consent or prone to disputes and disaffection because of the proceeds that come from licensing. And so across Africa, where these communities are recognized, there is a national agency that is in loco parentis with these communities and licensed on their behalf. And therefore, one is not sure how protection has featured effectively with this connection. And there's regulatory overkill, competition, tough wars in indigenous knowledge protection. I give two examples of Nigeria and South Africa. The Federal Ministry of Culture and Tourism, where I was privileged to head, there are 9 to 10 institutions involved in culture protection. And these institutions, obviously, working in the same area with substantial overlaps. In South Africa, there are 2 institutions, one housed in the Federal Ministry of and the Department of Trade, and the other, actually 3. Another housed in the Department of Arts and Culture, and then the third one housed in the Department of Science and Technology, all managing different aspects of indigenous knowledge. So there's competition, there are tough wars in terms of intellectual property protection that has relevance to indigenous knowledge. In Nigeria, for example, there is the Nigerian Copyright Commission, the Patent Office, the Trademarks Office, where, in a sense, one office would have done, in my own opinion, a lot more work in protecting aspects of indigenous knowledge. And then, of course, we are battling with managing the challenges of the digital environment, including artificial intelligence. And as we speak, there's African legislation on artificial intelligence. We do have policies. There's a national artificial intelligence policy in South Africa. There is a draft bill of AI legislation in Kenya. And so we're in a continent in which one of the most significant and impactful events in knowledge production and extraction is ongoing, and we haven't done anything about that. So if anybody wonders why our cultural and creative industries are not working, it is because of this regulatory incoherence. Do we know and feel that these areas are important? One wonders about that. So my response for now at this presentation is to talk about regulatory convergence in protecting indigenous knowledge for a creative economy, which goes of course, into the ideas of an innovation ecosystem that works. And for me, the most important factor why we are not doing so well, and of course, in different measures and computations, I could be wrong, and there are more other computations that could prove to be more salient. But for me, it is a policy issue. It's a political issue. How do we show that this is important? And I'm going to use the example of minerals in Africa. At the highest levels of African governments, minerals are protected and managed at the highest levels of Africa. Be it crude oil, be it gold, manganese. There's no African country blessed with minerals that does not take it as the most important asset. The wars in the Great Lakes region is about, access to critical rare earth minerals. Nigeria's political trajectory is around crude oil, and the economic feature of South Africa is baked carefully in the minerals. And yet, here we are with intangibles that are of so much promise to Africa. And one is not sure that this is a reality that is recognized in many African capitals. And the examples I gave of how these critical areas are managed at the bureaucratic level that looks like afterthoughts. They don't look like things that people have spent enough time thinking about. So if you manage the CCIs at the highest levels, and I mean at the highest levels of presidents and prime ministers, there will be mistakes made, but attention will be paid. The importance of these CCIs will resonate across the continent and across the countries. And I speak about the institutionally structured process for managing dependencies, building institutions, aligning policies, which this highest whole of government approach would drive. And I put a subnote there as this passive adoption and so-called free market principle. And I speak about Nollywood. All over the world, we extol how Nollywood grew from the market without government regulations. And sometimes you wonder whether that was a good thing. I do not advocate that government should be involved in making films, but it certainly cannot be possible that an industry like that would grow and be sustainable without some policy directions. And you see the simple examples that are coming on in terms of the quality from the African audiovisual industry. If enough care is not taken as to what is to be grown in that ecosystem, and you ask yourself how much, how long, how far can these industries go beyond what they are in terms of getting a global share for the audiovisual industry. Structural change through consistent policies. Of course, domestic innovation systems, and I use the word systems to think about the linkages between the production of knowledge, the intermediaries in the knowledge production, and the services that are offered. Has to be a consistent process thought through, and that can only happen at the highest levels of these African governments. And then, of course, the targeted financial incentives like guarantees that support IK-based CCIs are the highest policies. That's what makes them happen. The awareness, the ability to think about how to intervene and how to intervene. Even in the manner in which intellectual property laws are used to support the CCIs, there are questions about what do we regard as public domain materials that is available for creation. How do we do that? What areas should be concentrated on? What areas should be targeted? How do we train? And how do you ensure that the ideas and inspirations from the indigenous knowledge area become long-lasting, become as exciting as the present genres that have captured the attention of the world. And so in my book, I end the book with thinking about community participation and reward. And I kind of flesh it out here to try to link them in what I think would make some sense. So there has to be a harmonized set of public institutions that deal with indigenous knowledge protection, because it goes back to the manner in which those areas support the cultural and creative industries. The number of public institutions across Africa managing the cultural and creative industries are just too many. And anybody who deals with the bureaucrats wouldn't understand how they just don't want to give up what they consider their turf. And in that, they create the synergies, they are not cooperating, they're not speaking to each other, they hide under laws to talk about how they are created and how they need to exercise their mandate, without thinking carefully about how they're stifling innovation across the continent. And that whole of government approach is critical in training and development of skills across Africa, because that is where we're heading to our inability. And one example, of course, there are other reasons why the big streaming agents have left, are no longer supporting content production across some of the African countries. And it's because of the quality of the production of the films that are produced, for example. And that goes to an industry that's just grown on its own without so much direction and all that. Of course, resilient, which of course it can do better. So CCI, Culture and Creative Industry area that is headed by President or Prime Minister, has more prospects in a sense of cutting through the bureaucracy with, of course, industry stakeholders. And I've refrained from making very targeted recommendations, because I think that the challenge is getting it to work, and every country develops what its comparative advantage is and areas to concentrate and grow in a sense. Members of indigenous communities of origin and citizens of their political communities lay claim to use of this indigenous knowledge in their day-to-day cultural life, including using their ideas and expressions to make a living. And I've said, and as I've commented in my book, it's too late in the day to speak about performance looking for example, music performers going to a copyright agency or national cultural institution to look for permission to use some of these some of these inspiration that they've grown up with for their content production. That will be a difficult thing to manage. And then, of course, you have the communities who are there, who safeguard, who grow the indigenous knowledge, who reproduce them in different forms, and who, if you look closely at what is called indigenous music in Africa, you know it's not indigenous music in Africa. There are genres that have developed, for example, in many of these countries that are not in the mainstream. And so there is need for these communities to continue to thrive through festivals, through training, through the usual cultural reproductions that occur in communities, which is not happening. I mean, so how do you do that? And one of the recommendations I have made and I keep thinking about is that collective management organizations in Africa who have experience in collecting money, for example, in the music industry, are capable of doing that. It is difficult for many of the CMOs in Africa to keep some funds for training and development. I mean, so it is possible also to react against that, or in a sense, to push for some collection to be shared to the community. That very difficult issues about allocation, about cross-border ownership of cultural forms and arts in different countries and communities and all that. There are difficult problems about how to share, what to share, and all that, but that are all problems that can be resolved. And for years, the inability of these communities to, in a sense, be rewarded for their knowledge creates a stagnation of that knowledge that should be encouraged. And the growth of, if you like, African performance across the world shows the promise of these forms of participation, which cannot be ignored and which is important for Africa to continue. So my final take on the matter is that we have the potentials of a trillion global or trillion dollar creative economies in Africa if we pay attention at the political level as to how the structure should go. And of course, it cannot be outside an innovation system. I mean, so that's why I go back to innovation emergencies. And the question I ask are, does Africa understand that we are simply slipping into consumers of goods and services, and that we're not going to make enough? And do we have plans of turning that around beyond the rhetoric our leaders come out to reproduce that World Intellectual Property Days and United Nations commemorative days and speeches and all that, and really turn our countries, African countries, around and grow economies for jobs and the advantages or benefits of a productive economy. Thank you. Then let me stop.
We've come to the end of our allotted time now. So on behalf of all of us, I just want to say thank you very, very much, Prof Nwauche, for opening our minds to some of these important issues.